Good afternoon and welcome to our inaugural PROLang postgraduate research seminar. My name is Shaun Foley and I'm a postgraduate researcher and Wilson Quirk Scholar here at UCL SEAS, or SEAS for short, School of Slavonic and East European Studies. And I'm also the postgraduate coordinator for PROLang. PROLang is a new interdisciplinary initiative set up here at SEAS, and it stands for Policy, Research, Outreach in the field of language-based area studies, with particular focus on languages of Central, Eastern and Southeastern Europe and the Baltic region. We cover these languages here through our degree and evening classes. We offer a total of 18 languages from the region. PROLang's aims are to provide a forum for colleagues from UK and Central and East European partner universities and beyond to collaborate on interdisciplinary research topics with languages at the core, to interact with policymakers, practitioners and the public in order to aid and inform wider debates in Central and East European language-based area studies and cultural, economic, political and sociological research, to ensure that languages remain in focus in the post-Brexit landscape, to pay special attention to decolonising the curriculum for language courses by ensuring that minorities of any kind are well represented, as well as to create balanced multiple centres of interest, and to increase the esteem of SEAS as a global leader in language-based area studies. Another one of PROLang's aims at its creation was to ensure that the postgraduate voices are also brought centre stage, and this has led to the creation of PROLang's Spotlight On series, which will facilitate this process. I am delighted that our first event will be centred around the Polish language, and I will now pass the floor to my colleague, Dagmara Grabska, who is lecturer in Polish language here at SEAS.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dagmara Grabska. As Shaun has just said, I'm a lecturer of Polish language here at SEAS. And together with Shaun, I will chair this seminar. So first of all, a great welcome to the audience present here in person and everyone joining us online. Also welcome to our presenters. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation to come here and talk about your work. Also, thank you to the founders of PROLang, Ramona and Shaun Foley, without whose work this event would not be possible. So, as Shaun has just mentioned, our event today, Spotlight on Polish, putting postgraduate research center stage, opens a seminar series dedicated to postgraduate research involving language. And today, the focus is on postgraduate research on the Polish language. Our speakers represent 4 universities, UCL, University of Oxford, University of Birmingham, and the Jagiellonian University In. So before we give an outline of the event and introduce the speakers, let me say a few words about the presence of the Polish language studies at each of these universities. So at UCL, in particular here at SEAS, Polish can be studied as a single honors degree or in combination with another language. Also, both undergraduate and postgraduate students on other programs at UCL can take a Polish language module as an elective. Here at SEAS, we also offer Polish language evening courses. And as for research, we have a number of staff and PhD students with Polish studies expertise affiliated at the Polish Studies Research Group, whose research among subjects such as anthropology, history, sociology, and literature includes sociolinguistics. And postgraduate research on the Polish language at SEAS UCL will be showcased at our event by Anna Stawiecka. Oxford is another UK university where Polish can be studied to degree level in combination with other languages, as well as at undergraduate programs in linguistics. Oxford also offers graduate programs which include a substantial Polish language component. Apart from standard Polish language courses, Oxford offers courses in descriptive linguistic analysis of modern Polish and courses in the history of the language. Over the years, there has been a diverse community at Oxford of doctoral students in the field of Polish studies, working among others on literary theory and on syntax and other linguistic topics. And postgraduate research on the Polish language at Oxford University will be showcased today by Sidorkiewicz and Marianna Leszczyk, who will join us online. And as for the University of Birmingham, Well, the University of Birmingham does not offer Polish language programs. However, postgraduate research involving the Polish language has been conducted at the Department of Modern Languages and English Language and Linguistics. In particular, Polish has played a role in a research project called Out of Our Minds, whose aim is to shed light on how we learn languages. And the University of Birmingham and the project Out of Our Minds will be represented today by Justyna Mackiewicz. The Jagiellonian University in Kraków at the Faculty of Polish Studies offers a wide range of courses involving the Polish language. So at both undergraduate and postgraduate level, there are courses in Polish philology, teacher training, and Polish language in social communication, editorial studies. And then at postgraduate level, there are programs in creative writing, literary and cultural translation studies, speech and language therapy, and in teaching Polish as a foreign and second language. As for postgraduate research, the Jagiellonian University offers PhD programs in Polish studies at the Doctoral School in the Humanities. And the Jagiellonian University Doctoral School in the Humanities is represented at our event by Sebastian Hanek. And so to recap, we have 5 speakers. Anna Stanisz-Lubowiecka from CSUCL, Ola Sidorkiewicz from the University of Oxford, Marianna Leszczyk from the University of Oxford, Justyna Mackiewicz from the University of Birmingham, and Sebastian Hanek from the Jagiellonian University in Kraków. Their talks will cover topics involving the Polish language in politics, literature, culture, and cognitive research. Each talk will last 20 to 30 minutes, and after each talk, we'll have a few minutes for discussion, and we invite the audience here and online to give comments and ask questions. After the presentations part, we invite everyone to join us for a little wine reception. So without further ado, let's give the floor to the presenters. I will introduce our first presenter, and then the following presenters will be introduced by 2 of my students, Julia Siekierzyńska, a BA student in Polish and German, and Luke Zamojski-Frajtek, a BA student in Polish and East European Studies. And the last 2 presenters will be introduced by Shaun Foley. Okay, so Anna Stanisz-Lubowiecka, our first presenter, is a 4th-year PhD student at UCLC, funded by Silba's DTP, and she is supervised by Professor Jan Kubik and Professor Rita Valiardi. In her interdisciplinary PhD project entitled Polish Language and Political Ideologies, Language Ideologies in Linguistics Discourse in Poland from 1970, Anna looks at how language ideologies have been used to promote different political ideologies in Polish research history. She pursues her PhD, having completed a master's degree in general linguistics and comparative philology at the University of Oxford, as well as an MA in applied linguistics and intercultural communication at the Jagiellonian University in Kraków, both with the award of distinction. In May 2022, Anna was awarded CEES Excellent Scholarship, and in June 2019, she was a UCL finalist in the 3-minute thesis competition. Anna is a postgraduate teaching assistant at UCLC and a member of BOL, British Association of Applied Linguistics, BASIS, and Polish Studies Group. The title of her talk is Language of Liberalism, Liberal Language Ideology as a Pro-Democratic Resistance Strategy in the People's Republic of Poland, 1917-1950.
Thank you very much, Dagmara, for this very warm introduction. Thank you very much to all of you who came here today, to everyone who's joining us online. A massive thank you to my supervisors who couldn't be here for logistical reasons, but who are watching this session online as well, and to my 2-year-old who's watching it as well. So I'm going to start with a motto from the novel 1984 by George Orwell. Don't you see that the whole aim of newspeak is to narrow the range of thought? In the end, we shall make thought crime literally impossible because there will be no words in which to express it. The reason why I'm starting with this quote is that I will be looking at the discourse of professional linguists in the last 2 decades of communism. And I will argue that this concept of newspeak, so the language of a fictional totalitarian state of Oceania, became really influential in the way they described the language of communist propaganda. This presentation is based on the first chapter of my dissertation. There are 3 chapters in my dissertation, which is entitled Language, Ideologies and Polish Linguistic Discourse. So once again, I'm looking at the way that Polish linguists talk about language and how that influences Polish politics. And I look at 3 different time periods. So the first one is communist authoritarianism, so obviously the communist period. And I specifically focus on the last 2 decades, and the reasons for that I will explain in just a moment. I argue that the dominant language ideology in this period is liberal, and the recommended linguistic norms is neutrality, the neutrality of language, as opposed to ideological correctness. I also argue that the ultimate goal of promoting this ideology is to talk about the political system and to oppose the authoritarian regime and promote democracy in a country which at the time was believed to be totalitarian. Another ideology that became quite important in this period was standard language ideology, which argues for correct language. So in the 1970s and 80s, professional linguists started TV shows, radio programs, newspaper columns discussing correct language. And this particular ideology will become the dominant one in the next period, which is the period of liberal democracy building from 1989 to 2015. I argue that the ultimate goal of promoting this ideology is to construct the Polish language in the period of socio-political transformation when Poland left the Soviet bloc and entered the Western world. And the 3rd chapter of my dissertation, the 3rd period that I'm looking at, is the period of the so-called competitive authoritarianism or democratic backsliding, which started in 2015 and lasts until now. And what I argue is that the discourse of professional linguists discussing the language of politics is very similar to the discourse produced in the communist period. So essentially, linguists argue for liberal language that would promote pluralism as opposed to ideological correctness. And once again, that will be about the political system of the country rather than the language itself. So there are key 4 arguments that I'll try to make in this talk. The first one is that linguistic studies of the language of communist propaganda cannot be assumed to be objective. Now, objectivity is this ideal that was developed in the period of the Enlightenment, and a lot of the times liberalism is unaware of its ideological character. So my study contributes to that discussion of the ideological nature of liberalism. So I argue that linguistic studies of the language of communist propaganda are really a powerful political resistance strategy. I will also argue that by applying extra-linguistic liberal democratic values to their description of language, oppositional liberals formulated and propagated a liberal language ideology, but also at the time developed a language policy proposals for the ideal use of language, for the ideal of language of liberalism. I will also talk about the relationship between language ideologies, which is the concept I've been talking about a lot in this talk already, and political ideologies. And I argue that language ideologies are a specific subtype of political ideologies in which language is overtly discussed, but it's ultimately a powerful proxy for the desired political reality. My final point is that under the Soviet regime, liberal thinking was also there. So it's sometimes the literature assumes that liberalism is a Western ideology that wasn't really present in the communist bloc in Central and Eastern Europe. And I'm going to argue that that's not the case, looking at my data. So I'll start with a little bit of political context. So obviously, in Poland, we had censorship and propaganda in all state official media. What we understand by the term opposition is very different to the way that opposition is defined in liberal democratic regimes. So it's not a parliamentary opposition, but rather a heterogeneous set of intellectuals, academics, students with diversified views and attitudes, but also a huge role was played by the Catholic Church, poets, writers, artists, some workers and peasants. As I said, censorship was in place in all state or official media. So if oppositional activists wanted to publish something that wouldn't have to go through the censorship check, they would publish it in independent or underground uncensored presses and magazines, either in Poland or abroad, that would then be sort of smuggled to the country. I said before that I would focus on the last 2 decades of communism. Obviously, communism in Poland lasted much longer, but the reason why I'm only looking at these last 2 decades is because that was the time of an intensified breakdown of the regime. In the late 1960s, Poland was in severe economic crisis, which led to workers' protests in 1970. Before that, students and academics protested against censorship in March 1968, and these events made the system to gradually break down. So it wasn't until 1970 that I found linguistic studies of the language and propaganda. So there is basically no data for my topic before that time. And therefore this trend reversing model is seen in the data I'm looking at as well. So this concept I've been referring to all the time, language ideology, basically it's a concept that's been developed in a number of subdisciplines of linguistics, such as linguistic anthropology, sociolinguistics. It's an interdisciplinary approach in which we see that language has this political power. So because language constructs society, it's impossible to talk about language in a neutral, interest-free way. There is a huge amount of literature on language ideologies. However, I developed my own definition based on the definitions I found in the literature. The definitions that can be found in the literature consist of 2 components, one of them being depictions of the nature of language and its role in society. So basically, how does language work? How should it work as well? An example of that would be there is a correct variety of language. Another component that is often found in definitions of language ideology in the literature is that these ideas of language, these ideas about the nature of language, are used to legitimize or delegitimize a particular configuration of power. Now, this third component is rarely discussed in definitions. However, in studies of language ideologies, it comes up quite a lot, and that's language norms. So I think this element of this component of my definition really nicely bridges ideas about language and the sociopolitical reality that it tries to they try to legitimize. So my data, I'm looking at 3 collections of essays about the language of communist propaganda, and I basically had 2 conditions that I used for selection of data. So the first one was that they had to be written between 1970 and 1989. So in the case of the first 2 cases, the first 2 books, so Michał Głowiński and Jakub Karpiński, these are collections of essays that both of these authors had published in Polish uncensored presses or abroad. So it's 6 and 12 different essays respectively. And then the last source is a post-conference volume where a number of authors contributed. So the first condition, the first criterion was the date of publication, but the other one was whether it was published both in Poland and abroad to increase its significance. I use a combination of 3 different methods, so thematic analysis, in vivo, CDA, as I especially follow guidelines by Van Dijk and Verklof, and rhetorical analysis. So I will show that metaphors especially play a really important role in those descriptions of language. So I want to focus on my data analysis now, and basically I identified themes, first sort of analyzing data, seeing what's in there, but then applying the lens of my definition of language ideology, trying to match those different themes that were coming up with the 3 components of language ideology that I identified in my definition. So for ideas about the nature of language, I believe there are 2 most important themes. One is that nowa mowa, so this Polish calque of the word newspeak, obstructs communication. Głowiński says, nowa mowa is bad not because it's new, It is bad because it hinders, or in some cases makes interpersonal communication impossible, because it places predetermined arbitrary values above meanings, because it is an obstacle to free expression and often leads to gobbledygook. So I argue that this is not just a description, but this whole so-called description of Nowomowa is really underpinned by liberal democratic values, such as the right to be informed, such as the right for public discussion, such as the consent of the governed rather than manipulation. But above all, freedom of expression, which John Stuart Mill argues is the most important right under liberal ideology. The other important idea is that Nowomowa corrupts thought. So again, very close to what George Orwell said, Karpiński says the propagandist aims to blur in the mind of the recipient the differences between the state and the nation, between socialism and communism, between the party and society, between democracy and socialist democracy, between Polish interests and the interests of the socialist camp. It seems that these verbal identifications and confusions are supposed to make it difficult to think about political matters harmful to the authorities with at least a certain degree of precision. So again, it's against manipulation, which really is about the right to be informed, about the consent of the governed. Karpiński basically calls for honesty, or an accurate correspondence of language to reality, which he believes would be the case in a true democracy. I will talk about that problem of honesty in just a moment. And as I said before, there are quite a lot of metaphors here. The metaphor of pollution, a lot of catastrophism can be found in my data. So Rokoszowa, for example, says, if we start to see the language, it means that something is wrong with the language, that its basic signifying function has been disturbed. So this is a really nice example of these calls for neutral language that corresponds to reality in an accurate way. So the second component of my definition of language ideology is political legitimation. And I argue that these calls for democracy in the period of communist authoritarianism are usually more implied than explicit. However, some of my data shows that quite well. Karpiński says, for example, that the basis of his criticism is that Nowomowa legitimizes totalitarianism. So he says, when analyzing the language of political propaganda in countries ruled by communist parties, it's worth keeping in mind the socio-political background. We are talking about the language used by the party that exercises power and shapes social reality. This party wants to make the public believe that its power is legitimate, and the reality it shapes, mostly the future, but also the present, is bright. So he basically deconstructs the way in which the party uses the language, and he says, and obviously we can feel even in this short excerpt that this is the basis of his criticism. Głowicki says a very interesting thing. I don't know whether Nowomowa is reformable, but I do know that it can disappear only when democracy comes. Democracy without adjectives. Now, I want to be a little sneaky and say that actually it does have an adjective. So the kind of democracy that he's talking about is a liberal democracy, because we can see this democratic backsliding, and there is a very similar propaganda going on. So that again is this implied call for a liberal democratic system. And finally, linguistic norms, so neutrality as opposed to ideological correctness. Karpiński identifies Nowomowa as a tool for exercising power in totalitarian regimes. Now, again, we're talking about a system that's already breaking down. So this particular essay was published in 1980, and yet Karpiński calls Poland a totalitarian regime, and that hyperbole is quite telling as well. He says, in totalitarian regimes, political propaganda is a way of governing the souls. So this is a sentence, a quote that is attributed to Joseph Stalin, who apparently said, I raise my glass to you, poets and writers, the engineers of the human soul. So this belief that we can shape people's thinking by using a particular kind of language. He also argues that Nowomowa needs to be considered in the context of ideology and information. So once again, sort of deconstructing the way this language is used and arguing for a different one, for a neutral one. in all these different analyses, this is something that I will not have time to talk about in greater detail, but all of these different sources talk about different rhetorical devices that are used by the party in the language of the party. I'll just give two examples to basically show how these rhetorical devices achieve ideological correctness. Binarism is arguably the biggest one. It's the imposition of a clear value sign. So again, an implicit call for a language without values that would just be a description of the world, of the reality. And again, it's about the judgments that must be clear and unambiguous. And Karpiński talks about omissions as a way to hide failures. So again, this kind of full of interest use of language. Now I'll move on to the discussion of these different things that we saw in the data. First of all, the problem of neutrality. Catherine Woolard talks about it using the word the referentialist ideology. So in linguistics, starting from the Saussure, there is this belief that language corresponds to reality. But it's not just a description of how language works, it's also a normative statement. And in the social sciences, it's really problematic. Is there objective reality behind language? A lot of not only linguists, but also sociologists would argue that language constructs society. So there is no objective reality sort of out there that the language would just describe. And on the other hand, there is this issue of language variation and change. So language evolves in time, language differs across space, from speaker to speaker, from region to region, from a social group to a social group, and therefore meanings cannot be fixed. So communication, so a lot of the times in linguistics, because of this referentialist ideology, there is this belief that communication really is a sort of telementation. So there is some sort of message that is packed and then unpacked by the receiver. But actually a lot of creativity has to be involved in the process. So it's impossible to just sort of, put some sort of content in people's minds. Another issue with my data is the problem of honesty. And Jolanta Antas, my the supervisor of my MA dissertation from the Jagiellonian University, wrote a book about lies and lying. So that's obviously closely related to the issue of manipulation. And here is what she says. Telling the truth is giving linguistic, or at least communicative, testimony to the content of our beliefs about it, while lying is giving such testimony to the false content of the beliefs about what we believe to be true when we are telling the truth. In fact, we only bear witness to our notions of what we believe to be true, not to the facts, and we may be wrong. So that obviously puts into question the whole idea of honesty versus manipulation. Is that even possible? The debate in linguistics whether language can influence cognition is huge, and it's impossible to resolve, really. I mean, there are so many different views, so many different studies from so many different disciplines or subdisciplines related to language, that it's definitely not fair to say that language does influence thought, full stop. And finally, my final point of criticism is maybe there is a little bit of elitism in that data as well, because if the researchers can see that manipulation, then how about other people? And Grabska wrote a really interesting study of this what she called anti-totalitarian language as a form of linguistic self-defense that Polish people developed in the 1980s. And so that would actually show that Polish people were aware of being manipulated, and they developed an alternative language to communicate. So again, something that really undermines one of the ideas visible in my data. And obviously, the whole point of people genuinely supporting the communist parties, they were more and more in minority with time as the system broke down, but actually they were still there. That's not something that my data accounts for at all. Why does it matter? Obviously, it matters for a number of reasons, for language policy, the politics of language more broadly, but also because of the context of what's going on in Poland right now, and not just in Poland. So when I started this PhD, I was really interested in the standard language ideology, so what happened after the collapse of communism. Then I looked at what happened before, because I thought it would be really interesting to see this kind of, had to have that sort of comparative perspective. But I was very strong, like, I'm not going into politics. And then, this is what happened. So I couldn't really turn a blind eye to that, and I had to address it. I basically argue that members of the Peace Party and the media supporting it use a very similar linguistic strategies to those in the political and media discourse in Polish communist authoritarianism. But I also argue that linguistic studies of the language of propaganda are very similar. They draw heavily and explicitly on the studies of the language of communist propaganda. But there is one key difference. So at the moment, these calls for democracy are much more powerful and explicit. So to conclude, in this talk, I have argued that linguistic studies of Nowa Mowa in the last 2 decades of state socialism in Poland were not objective, but constituted a powerful political resistance strategy. I argue that the language ideology that was adopted was liberal, and its tenet was that language should correspond to reality in an accurate way so that people are not manipulated. But it's not really a description, it's a normative statement on not only what the desired language should be, but also what the political reality should be like. And on top of explicit and implicit calls for democracy, the main idea is about the nature of language, so that it devastates language, or that Nowa Mowa devastates language or corrupts thought, as well as the ideal of neutrality as the main linguistic norm, are founded on the referentialist ideology, which ultimately is an expression of liberal ideology. And finally, metalinguistic discourse can be a powerful vehicle for the promotion of political ideologies and an important area of political contestation. I have argued that language ideologies are variants of political ideologies which explicitly discuss language, but implicitly make normative statements about the political system that language represents. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anna. Do we have any questions from the audience? Do we have any questions or comments online?
If anyone has any,
Okay,
come back to it.
yeah, we'll have a discussion after all the questions. Okay, so our next presenter is Sidorkiewicz, and she will be introduced by Julia Siedorkiewicz, Vice Chair. So,
So our next presenter, Sidorkiewicz, is a PhD candidate at the University of Oxford, interested in the intersections of language and national identity, particularly in émigré writing. She is working on 20th century literature, currently focusing on works by Stefan Themerson, Józef Czapski, and Marianna Kuncewicz. In the past, she has worked comparatively across English, French, German, and Polish modernist literature. She is also the co-convener of the Oxford Comparative Criticism and Translation Discussion Group, as well as of the Polish Studies Working Group, also based at the University of Oxford. Her talk title for today will be Stefan Themerson and Marianna Kuncewicz in Search of a New Language.
Thank you so much for this introduction, and thank you, Anna, for your fascinating talk. It's really interesting for me to hear it, because we've heard from you what linguists have to say about language and the language ideologies, but I think I'll touch a bit upon what poets and writers have to say about it. So I think it could be an interesting dialogue. So welcome everyone, and thank you so much for coming today. I will be saying a few words about my doctoral research and how it relates to language and the Polish language in particular. But before I do so, I'd like to thank Ramona Gonzo, Dagmara, Grabska, and Shaun Foley for extending their invitation to me. Your new project, PROLang, is a really important initiative which reminds us all of the broader social relevance of language learning. This is a cause I really identify with, so I very much admire your efforts, and best of luck with all your future activities. Right, so next slide, please. My name is Sidorkiewicz. As you heard, I'm in my second year of my PhD at the Faculty of Medieval and Modern Languages, and my thesis looks at the translingual writings of Stefan Themerson, Marianna Kuncewicz, and Józef Czapski, and the shared striving towards what I call liberating language. Next slide. I chose to use the word liberating for its double meaning, both as a verb denoting an act of emancipating something from the existing structures, as well as an adjective describing an action that aids the process of freeing or emancipating oneself. Across the works I analyze in my thesis, there is an overwhelming sense that language, a powerful tool, has been compromised. This is what links to our research in part. Instead of aiding communication, it's now a tool of exclusion and of manipulation. Vital context to these reflections are the Second World War, the experience of immigration and of the communist regime, the Polish People's Republic. But to say that the factors that influence the writers I look at are specifically Polish or purely sociopolitical would be an understatement. So I view their works as representing broader European modernist trends in explorations of the limits of language, new modes of artistic expression, and of the general spirit of formal experimentation. So I interpret their texts both as attempts at reclaiming language in its constructive use as a means of communication rather than of political propaganda, and as attempts at hiding individual artistic idiom, or indeed language, that would allow their authors to express themselves free of overbearing sociopolitical factors or the need for compromise. This means that in their writings, as well as in my thesis, the definition of language is very broad and constantly changing. I'll try to illustrate what I mean by this in a moment. Even though in my thesis I look at 3 writers, today I'd like to focus on 2 of them, the less known Stefan Themerson. Some of you might have already heard me speak about him at Anne White's conference, as well as Marianna Kuncewicz. And let me first briefly introduce the authors. Although both Themerson and Kuncewicz led very full lives, I'd like to focus on those biographical facts that might explain their particular interest in language. First of all, they were not just writers. Themerson began his career in the interwar era as the author of children's books and director of avant-garde films. This is also why he and his wife emigrated to Paris already in 1938 to develop their filmmaking skills. In fact, Stefan and Franciszka collaborated almost on all of their artistic works, sort of blurring the question of authorship. During the Second World War, they settled in London, which is where they remained until the end of their lives. And it was also there that they founded their publishing house, Gabor Bockus Press, which focused on producing bestlookers as opposed to bestsellers, and published in translation the works of European avant-garde, introducing some of its key figures to the English audience for the first time. And I've got one of their books, the second one ever printed on the hand press in 400 copies in 1949, and I'd love to show it to you later if you'd like to see it. It's quite a beautiful artifact, so but good to have a look as well later on. For a short period of time, the publishing house also hosted the Gabor Bockus Common Room, which was a space of creative dialogue between artists and scientists. Insofar as literary work is concerned, Themerson wrote poetry, novels, short stories, a play, and an opera. And in his writing, he used English, French, and Polish, self-translating and experimenting with the mixing. Similarly, Marianna Kuncewicz was not just a writer, but also a trained musician. Before embarking on her literary career, she actually considered her career in music. She also worked as a translator from English, from French, from German, and she emigrated following the outbreak of the Second World War, settling first in Paris, then in London, and then again after 15 years or so, moving to the United States. One of her most interesting initiatives, which sprang from that very experience of migration and constant movement, was the petition that she issued to the United Nations in 1949, in which she asked for world citizenship to be given to stateless people. The petition, albeit unsuccessful, was signed by 26 known intellectuals such as Albert Einstein, Bertrand Russell, and George Bernard Shaw. She reached them through her work at the Polish Pen Club and then her work at the Pen Club for Writers in Exile, where she was very active. And apart from her work in those various organizations, she remained a very prolific writer, producing short stories, novels, radio series, and diligenza or stagecoaches, a word she used to refer to her travel writing. Just like Themerson, she experimented with various languages and self-translation, writing predominantly in Polish, but also in French and in English. Now, as I discovered at the Themerson archive at the National Library in Warsaw, there exists a vast body of correspondence between Themerson and Kuncewicz. Rather unexpectedly, as I didn't know that going in, they were lifelong friends. One of the most interesting exchanges begins with Themerson's response to Kuncewicz's invitation to join an organization bringing together exiled authors who choose to remain outside of their home countries in order to be able to publish without censorship. In his response, Themerson argues that the search for freedom of expression should not be mistakenly linked to the condition of exile, and that therefore he was not interested in joining. This letter has now come to be seen as an important piece of writing that positioned Themerson very explicitly outside of the Polish emigre circles in London. Kuncewicz responded to this, and sharing with him the interest in fluid identities and the desire to escape straightforward classifications, she was also aware of the institutional backing that was needed for a writer without a home country to write and make their living in a foreign country. As she put it, Themerson's letter was in the philosophical sense right, but in the practical and charitable sense not. The contrast between the philosophical and the practical aspects of their life in immigration is perhaps what best embodies the difference between their artistic projects. Sharing multiple defining experiences and as writer possessing a similar trust in language and its potential to bring about change, they pursue diverging paths both artistically and socially. Now I'll slowly begin zooming in on language and the texts I picked for today. As I mentioned, both Themerson and Kuncewicz shared the rather bleak sense that language has been taken from them, corrupted and repurposed. At the same time, they very much believed that it was still redeemable. Disillusioned with the various misuses and misappropriations of language, they did not want to give up on it, but rather through formal and linguistic experiments, they wanted to open up spaces and create a moment in which it could be liberated. One of Themerson's responses to the crisis of language, and one which places him amongst the European avant-garde of his time, is that of semantic poetry. I'll go into the practical details of it in a moment, but first I'd like to show you the theoretical considerations that led to these experiments. The project began with his novel Vayamos, which I will briefly discuss today, but it remained an important part of his artistic work throughout his life for decades. In the 1970s, he published a collection which comprised all of his writing on the topic, and it was titled On Semantic Poetry. There he explained it as follows. It was a refusal to be taken away from reality, a refusal to be taken for a ride that made me devise, not to say burst, into semantic poetry some 30 years ago, before the time of television, at the time when political demagogues of all sorts were using oratory devices stolen from poets, just as today, at this time of enlightenment through advertising, commercial demagogues are using motion picture tricks stolen from visual artists. And then again, he would say, I wanted to strip words of their associations, to cut their links with the past. This rebellion was anti-romantic and anti-ecstatic. It was directed both against political rhetoricians and against Joycean avant-coureurs, against associational thickets of Eliot and the verboidal surrealisms of history. I wanted to disinfect the words, scrub them right to the very bone of their dictionary definitions. That was how, somewhat ferociously and sardonically, I invented semantic poetry. It was meant to be funny, both serious and funny. This passage certainly carries the force of a manifesto, a genre characteristic of early 20th century European artistic scene. It came about as a reaction to, or indeed against, the use of emotionally charged language in order to further political and commercial agendas. So what was its method? As the narrator of Vayamos explains to us, each of the semantic poetry words should have one and only one meaning. They should be well defined. The word war, for example, carries with it different associations for different people. Thus, it's good for a political speech, but in a poem, I'd prefer to find instead a more exact definition, for instance, that in my dictionary. The open conflict between nations or active international hostility carried on by force of arms. Sounds a bit funny. Both funny and serious, one might say. Let's take a step back now, as I'll briefly introduce the plot of Bajamus. It was Themerson's first full-length novel, published in fragments in the emigre journal Nowa Polska. It has a Polish language and an English language version, both authored by Themerson. It follows the adventures of the narrator of the novel, who's accompanied by the three-legged Bajamus that you can see. And it focuses on the former's search for the meaning of semantic poetry. Halfway through the novel, the reader is presented with various examples of semantic translation, the necessary step which helps to transform poetry into its semantic counterpart. And so returning to the quote about political and poetic renderings of war, here is what happens in Bajamus. I'll now play a famous Polish song, Żurawiejka, whose lyrics and melody tend to elicit an emotional response, a sense of solidarity or togetherness and readiness to face obstacles. If you click on poetry, you should be able to, there's a link in it. You can
have to play the presentation and then.
Yeah. Great. And it's just a minute.
Looking for a good deal on a car. It's many different sites. Search for free translation.
You can sort of, I think you get a sense of the of what it's about, and so on. And if we now could go back to the PowerPoint, the next slide shows you how it looks like in semantic translation. Here we go. How nice it is in that jolly good open conflict between nations, how pretty it is in that jolly smart active international hostility carried on by force of arms, when a light cavalry soldier armed with a weapon of offense and defense consisting of a pointed iron head fixed to a shaft, 9 or 10 feet in length, used for thrusting and parrying, passes through the space from the level of the spine of the horse to the level of the earth, from the level of the spine of the horse to the level of the earth, and so on and so on. So this is the Żurawiejka in semantic translation. I'd be very curious to know what you felt first hearing the original song and then seeing this. Perhaps there'll be some time to discuss it in the Q&A. What I think happens is that the method of semantic poetry allows for a metacognitive mode of reading. It's perhaps similar to Bertolt Brecht's Verfremdungseffect, whereby theatre audience would be constantly reminded of the artificiality of the performance they're witnessing in order to be able to critically reflect on the themes and contents of the performance. Similarly, the readers of semantic poetry are kept in a state of suspension, as the lengthy definitions never really allow them to find a melody or to follow a flow of the poem. Instead, they're constantly reminded of the dangerous conventionality of language. And speaking of melodies of conventions, Kuncewicz argued that artificial languages like Esperanto, useful for informational, commercial, and scientific exchange, are rendered helpless in the face of the drama, whimsy, and humor of a living language. On the other hand, political and ideological imperialism that imposes a single speech on its multilingual citizenry is met with increasing resistance. Along with the unifying means of music and painting, the gift of the Holy Spirit, which untangles the tongues of the apostles of literature, thus appears to be one of the most promising attempts at opening up national, regional, and doctrinal ghettos. And so for Kuncewicz, one of the ways of recovering language was to increase its variety, both in terms of the tongue spoken and utilized in writing, as well as in terms of broadening its definition so that it encompasses other forms of communication, such as music or painting. And like Themerson, Kuncewicz does not come up with a clearly defined artistic method such as semantic poetry, but rather subtly weaves into her narrative the issues of language and translation, introducing them as important characteristics of her protagonists and as key factors shaping the development of her narrative. One of the languages available to Kuncewicz and her protagonist is that of myth. Discussing her inspiration to write the novel, Kuncewicz says that it came to her in Cornwall. More specifically, she says that the wilderness where once Tristan and Isolde had woven their mysteries was now filled with Polish pilots on vacation and local girls in love with them. The people were different, but the drama was still the same. The point where two strangenesses meet, Lothian and Cornwall, Ireland and Cornwall, Poland and Great Britain, youth, old age, society, individual, faith, faithlessness, life, time. Cornwall, the place where Kuncewicz hid from the bombs falling on London, inspires her to consider the passing of time and what stays behind. The myth of Tristan and Isolde becomes a vessel for communication, perhaps even a language in its own right. Kuncewicz says that the attraction of myths lies precisely in the fact that they take life out of the workings of time and are able to build unity out of strangeness. In the novel, which closely mirrors the plot of the Cornish myth and takes place immediately after the Second World War, as the date indicates, all characters relate to their mythical predecessors and use them to reflect on themselves, their actions and relationships. The momentum of the narrative is therefore gained both through alignment and through confrontation with the myth. In the process, both similarities and differences are accounted for, enabling communication across time, languages, and cultures without erasing idiosyncrasies. The novel's narrator, Wanda, is a translator by profession, so that's a rather uncommon characteristic in Polish prose in the 20th century. She's a Polish migrant who moved to the United Kingdom after the outbreak of the Second World War. With this multilingual and multicultural experience, she's highly attuned to the questions of language. Moreover, she's aware of the convention in which she's operating, that of the Cornish myth, and as a narrator, she serves as a mediator, a translator who transposes and weaves the experiences of the novel's characters into one coherent narrative. Her son, Michał, the titular Tristan, fought in the war, and he's appearing in the novel with a letter sent to his mum and with the answer to help him move to the UK to join her. As it turns out, the music lessons she made him take in his childhood saved his life in the Nazi camp, as he was asked to play the accordion for the prison guards. In Tristan 1946, music also takes on the role of the magic potion from the myth. Traditionally, Tristan and Isolde fall in love, drinking a mixture meant for Isolde and her husband to be King Mark. In Kuncewicz, Kathleen Isolde, her mum sends her a recording of the only symphony ever composed by the French Romantic composer César Franck, meant as a wedding gift for her and for Professor James Bradley in the novel's King Mark. When Wanda plays it one night, Michał and Kasia, as he calls her, first succumb to the mutual feeling. As Wanda describes it, something undesired was taking place, something stronger than they were. In my eyes, the girl and the boy were turning into animals in a state of grace. It no longer mattered where they came from or where they were going. They fell into a realm where human judgments and objectives lost their meaning. Music becomes a language which transcends borders and even leads to the transgression of social mores. Kathleen, the Irish Isolde, and Michał, the Polish Tristan, do not need to speak the same language to understand the force of the romantic melody and to give in to it. So I hope I was able to give you a sense of the questions I'm posing and the analyses that I am conducting in my doctoral work. I'd be very curious to hear what you think about this line of inquiry and what other uses of language you think I might want to consider. Many thanks.
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions, comments, either here or online?
Rita sent her congratulations to you.
Thank you. So we move on at the end.
Yeah.
Okay. So our next presenter is Marianna Leszczyk from University of Oxford. She should be online. Yes, she is. Okay. And she will be introduced by Luke Samoyski right back.
So Marianna Leszczyk is a PhD candidate in classical reception at the University of Oxford. Her doctoral research analyzes the presence of classical antiquity in the prose of Zbigniew Herbert, with a focus on Herbert's essays on travel and culture, reading Herbert's engagement with antiquity through the lens of reception theory. Marianna interrogates questions of intermediality, representation, and the relationship between a Polish author and the Greco-Roman heritage. Other academic interests, similarly cutting across antiquity and modernity, include trauma studies, cultural hybridity, and points of friction in cultural and historical narratives. She is also the co-convener of the Polish Studies Working Group based at Oxford. Thank you.
Hello?
Hello, yes, we can hear you.
Hello. I cannot seem to turn on my video, but that's fine.
You can try again now if it might work.
Right.
Yeah, there we go.
Right. Hello.
Hello.
Hello. So nice to see everyone, and thank you so much for having me remotely. I would have loved to come to London and to your department, but my health has stopped me from doing so, unfortunately. So I hope that this presentation can still work out equally well online, and I will do my best to be comprehensible for you as well. But if you can't hear me or anything, just stop me that very moment, and I will repeat anything you didn't hear. And it would be nice as well if I could share my screen. I think I should have the permission to do so. So I might try doing so in a second. But before that, I just wanted to thank Anna and Ola for the wonderful presentations that have come before. And I'm really glad that we're getting all those different angles on the Polish language. So we had language and ideology, but also with Ola, language and language. So how do we mediate between languages? How do we mediate between also language and music? So there's different like art forms coming in already. So my presentation will be focused on the mediation between language and visual arts and the transmedial exchange between something that maybe isn't even expressible in language, so visual works of art, and the Polish author Zbigniew Herbert, who is still struggling to translate visual art into writing. So I'm quite interested what the panelists, but also the audience will have to say on this yet again new role of language in mediating between the expressible and the inexpressible, or perhaps truth, reality, and then again the unreality of language, or is language reality itself? So we'll see. So I will try to open my PowerPoint now. I hope it will work for everyone. So just let me know if it doesn't. Okay, so can everyone see?
Yes.
Okay, great. Right. So as I have already said, I will be talking about intermediality, the question of translation of works of art into language in the Polish poet Zbigniew Herbert, who I think to many of you in the room does not need an introduction, but I will still give you a quick run through his oeuvre. So he published 9 poetry collections, which are considered to have shaped modern Polish poetry, also 3 essay collections and 2 plays during his lifetime. And it says 2 on the handout because one of them was unpublished, which I will go into later in the presentation. So 9 poetry collections, 2 published travelogues, 3 unpublished travelogues altogether, 5 plays. However, he is primarily known for his poetry and also for his poetic engagements in the 1980s and in the Solidarność era, where he took the role of a very much poetic voice of the opposition. This also ties into what Anna was saying about how the opposition was not just political, but also very much artistic. And Zbigniew Herbert was certainly one of those artistic voices of the Polish opposition during the late years of communism. So my work focuses primarily on his prose oeuvre because I do believe that the prose oeuvre is still understudied. And there's been a lot said about the poetry, but there's still more to be said about the prose. So I will be giving you an insight into this today. So the text I want to look at today stems from the essay Labyrinth by the Sea, from the essay collection of the same name, which was published in 73. Sorry, not published in 73. It was submitted for publication in 73, but never published for unknown reasons, especially since all the essays in the collections were published individually, but the book itself was rejected and we do not know how. And it was only properly published posthumously in 2000 at the initiative of Herbert's wife, Katarzyna Herbert. So if published as intended, Labyrinth by the Sea would have been the second essay collection in what now forms a trilogy of travelogues thematizing Herbert's journeys in Western Europe. The first one, which contributed to his rising fame at the time, published shortly after his initial essay poetry collections, was Barbarian in the Garden. And the last one was Still Life of a Bridal, Martwa Natura z Wędzidłem, published in 93, which changes the north-south binary and speaks about Herbert's travels in the Netherlands, so in the European south, north rather than the European south. And when it comes to the tone of the travelogue, Labyrinth by the Sea does sit in the middle of this binary of a rather poetic playfulness of Barbarian and this very culturally authoritative tone of Still Life. So overall, Herbert's travel essays are defined by this fascinating intertwining of personal experiences with the seemingly objective discourses of history and art criticism. And again, we're looking at what Anna said about objectivity. Can language ever be objective? Can history ever be objective? And those travelogues have quite an unconcealed didactic aim of teaching Herbert's readers about the West, about its cultures, about its history. And however, they're still very much experiential in nature. So they are rooted in the travelogue genre and they intertwine those two aims. So the telling of experience, but also didacticism. And in this presentation, I hope to show how strongly the personal and the impersonal can be intertwined in this way. So before diving into the passage, I would like to come back to the question of Herbert's biography and his public authority, and also to the way it extended into the sphere of visual art. As is not discussed often enough, Herbert was also active as an art critic since the 1950s, reviewing visual art exhibitions and writing about artists for the Polish press. Although he was never trained as an art critic, which is also really interesting. And in a fascinating article on Still Life of a Bridal that appeared in recent years, the Polish art historian Piotr Oczko criticized the way that probably because of Herbert's art critical activities, Still Life was then received as this kind of guidebook to receiving Dutch art, despite the fact that Herbert has a very positivist approach of looking through art. So he sees, looking at art. So he sees art as a direct representation of historical reality. Although we can argue about whether this is true in what we will see now in the artwork I will discuss. But it's often assumed that he has this preference for very mimetic interpretations of art. And he sees art as a direct window into history. Again, the question of language, truth, reality, etc. And one last aspect I would like to point to when it comes to Herbert and visual art is that Herbert was also a prolific draftsman himself, which is also little known. And he left behind hundreds of notebooks of drawings. So if his statements on the topic are to be believed, he never actually took photographs while traveling, but instead used his drawings as a way of documenting his journeys. As you can see, those drawings are highly minimalist and fragmentary in the representation of art and reality, which contrasts with his gaze as an art critic, who showed little admiration for contemporary abstract art. So this is some more of Herbert drawings for your reference. But so yeah, with all of this in mind, let us now move to the focus of the session, which is Herbert's ekphrasis of the Hagia Triada sarcophagus. The Hagia Triada sarcophagus is a Minoan artifact found in the Museum of Knossos, and it's a late Minoan, we now think, sarcophagus. So it's a very artifact of the very early sarcophagus of the Minoan civilization. So Herbert encounters the sarcophagus in the Archaeological Museum in Heraklion, which is described in the first half of the essay Labyrinth in the Sea, which is an account of Herbert's journey to Crete in 64. So it's important to note that this description starts with the phrase, "I remember well the day I entered the museum," and is kept in past tense, as you will see, which implies a writing from memory rather than speaking from the moment itself. So Herbert enters the museum 2 hours before closing time and rushes through the collection without giving it much attention. And then he comes to a halt in the fresco room where the long-awaited Minoan paintings fail to impress him. He discovers through careful examination that all of them are reproductions done by the discoverer of the Minoan civilization, Arthur Evans. So then the essay jumps to Herbert's description of his own research he did on the matter to discover why the reproductions, what the history behind this is. And after we have been given a bit of that context, but also Herbert's personal value judgments on those frescoes, we jump to the sarcophagus. And I will show you the Polish in a second. So after a round of short descriptions of the other frescoes in the room, Herbert stumbles on the sarcophagus from Hagia Triada and experiences a revelation. In Polish, it's olśnienie. And he circles the sarcophagus reverently, only to be interrupted by the closing of the museum. He is fighting his desire to be locked up together with the artifact to memorize all its colors and lines, but however, he has to leave. So again, you can see the Polish and the underlined phrases, so it's nauczy się na pamięć, which is really interesting in terms of how we consume art. So Herbert returns to the museum the next day with the intention of studying the sarcophagus in more detail. And this is when the ekphrasis follows. So again, the ekphrasis is the description in text of a visual work of art. Herbert begins by offering some historical information on the sarcophagus, as I've mentioned, and he then dives into a careful ekphrastic description of all its sites one by one, which replicates his initial movement of walking around the sarcophagus. Importantly, he begins, oh, sorry, I think I skipped a slide. Okay. Right, so I was just talking about this, but what I wanted to mention before this, excuse me. So what I wanted to mention before this is how initially, before he gets into this description, he speaks of the sarcophagus as defending itself against interpretation. And also in the Polish, which I think works a bit better than the nosy and the arrogant, you can see people who try to describe works of art as hałaśliwi I przemądrzali. And this is particularly important because then we will just, as I just started saying by missing the slide, we'll go on to Herbert's own description of the sarcophagus. So we can think about whether he himself becomes this noisy and arrogant person that he mentions on this slide. So now that I have mentioned this, let's return to the one I started speaking about. Right, so he had just been thinking about the resistance to interpretation, the role of the critic, the role of language as noisy and arrogance, but now he starts offering his own description, which begins by basically describing the sarcophagus as a masterpiece, arcydzieło in Polish. And he gives his own definition of the term, which is also quite interesting. even though not really related to the question of language, but rather how he conceives of history of civilizations. But what is quite important is then again that he presents himself as the one who will try to describe this masterpiece, but he isn't sure whether he will succeed. So he says, and this is the full quote, "The torment of description, for I will have to describe the sarcophagus, and the description will be like any description, long, dull, like an inventory, the enumeration of figures and objects. I will not be able to avoid unwinding sentences like bandages, from left to right, against the rules of sight, which gives the whole in the clear and sudden light of simultaneous presence." So the Polish is even more fascinating because it uses impersonal forms throughout, which makes both the urgency of the sarcophagus to be described and the impossibility of avoiding the distortion of sight, something that is not limited to Herbert's own subjectivity, as the English would suggest. What is so crucial here, however, is that Herbert is not trying to create the illusion of the transparency of language. As we have heard before, language is transparent, objective. On the contrary, he warns the reader that his description will be nothing like the experience of seeing the sarcophagus in real life. And yet, as we can imagine, he proceeds to describe the sarcophagus in extensive formal detail, which I would like to pass over now to focus on some more conceptual questions, which will also relate to the use of language. So what I would like to draw your attention to in the question of Herbert's ekphrasis is this gradual slippage from quite formal description, which occurs in the beginning, and inscription, following Tomasz Tomasik here, a Polish scholar who uses Bach's concept of the punctum to refer to the writing into of a subjective reaction into a work of art. So after the last section of the painting, which he again meticulously describes, Herbert writes that we now touch on the very heart of the scene, the mystery of the mysteries, the mystical cause. To Herbert, it is a resurrected man shown on the sarcophagus, and I can show you images later on, who is the hero of the drama and around whom the whole scene depicted on the sarcophagus is mystically centered. The search for the mystery of art resurfaces throughout Herbert's oeuvre and has often been read by many interpreters, such as Adam Dziadek, in a religious framework. Personally, I am more intrigued by this interpretation offered by Tomasik, who, as I mentioned, uses Bach's concept of the punctum, which the author outlined in Camera Lucida, and which he defines as something that fixates the individual viewer's consciousness. And it is in that very moment, Tomasik writes, that the ekphrastic process, writing about, becomes writing into. So when objectivity becomes subjectivity. But if you have encountered Bach's text before, you might remember that the punctum is always something that is highly subjective and unique to each viewer. However, at this point in Herbert's description, all distinction between the subjective and the objective have collapsed, as Tomasik's theory would suggest as well. So he is now presenting interpretation as constantly new layers of facts in an almost matter-of-fact tone. So Herbert writes that the sarcophagus is not only a masterpiece, it is also the only surviving Minoan book of the dead, an exact portrayal of a funeral ritual, so that it has the value of a document, a visual record of an ancient tradition. So again, after having meticulously described the object, Herbert returns to his point of departure and perhaps also the driving force of this ekphrasis, which is the sarcophagus's status as a masterpiece. After having analyzed it so meticulously, he again returns to the first thing that caught his attention about the piece, or about the artwork in this sense. And Roma Sendica, who has analyzed Herbert's ekphrasis in multiple of his essays, but also his poetry, writes that often the identification of something as a masterpiece is related to, quote, an effort to partake in the canon of visual culture, or even of the shaping of cultural heritage. So again, we can recall many things at this point. Firstly, Herbert's art historical effort in Poland, then again, his oppositional function within Polish culture and his kind of really like strong drive to introduce Western culture into the communist dominated space of Polish cultural production. But also again, the question of language and in how far can language mark something as something else, and how far can language define something as something that it is not. So to return to this description, Herbert is actually quite straightforward about the fact that it is mostly his subjective experience that will drive it. And it's only his own revelation that has caused the whole description. However, then again, he ends with this timeless image of the sarcophagus as truly representing a culture's untiring immortality. Again, I'm curious what you will say about this very Christian Catholic image in the context of an Asian culture. And he basically skips from, well, quite self-aware subjectivity to completely unself-aware subjectivity that is writing into objectivity. So yes, I would just be very curious to hear if there are any comments on those different layers of language. And to very quickly end this with one last link between the beginning of and the end of the ekphrasis, I would like to point to Herbert's initial worry about the distortive nature of language and his description, and then his designation of the sarcophagus as an exact representation of ritual. So I do wonder in how far is this worry about his own representation of something still present in his voicing of this very authoritative claim that the sarcophagus is an exact representation, this time visual, of Minoan culture. So there seems to be a clear tension between the knowledge of the impossibility of representation to then a claim to its exactness, however in a different form. So yeah, just in general, to really quickly wrap this up, I'd be really interested to hear what everyone thinks about the differences in visual and linguistic representation and how those two overlap in Herbert's case, and how he struggles to both translate visual representation into verbal representation while also bridging all those like hurdles that language throws in his way, and if he is as self-aware of them as he thinks. And yeah, I think that's it. If you want to see more images of the sarcophagus, do let me know so I can show them before I finish my presentation. But yeah, that's all from me. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Marianna, do we have any comments, questions? Either here or no? Yeah, okay. Okay, so
the next presentation will be by Justyna Mackiewicz, a research associate in language learning at the University of Birmingham and part of the postdoctoral research associates for Out of Our Minds. Justyna Mackiewicz is a postdoctoral research associate at the Department of Modern Languages, University of Birmingham, and she also holds a PhD in applied linguistics in the University of New York. Her main research interests are in international students, language and literacy skills, development of language and literacy skills in university students from a variety of linguistic backgrounds over time, and linguistic factors that impact academic achievement. She's also passionate about open science and reproducible research practices. I'll hand over to Justyna.
Thank you so much, Shaun, for this kind introduction. Thank you so much for you two and Dagmara for the invitation, especially that Dagmara visited us and our lab in Birmingham some time ago. And thank you so much for coming and joining me in this presentation. I'm I'm really fascinated after listening to all this presentation so far. And I think that each of us can have like a different definition of what language is. And in today's talk, I will be telling you that I view language as a tool that helps us in researching cognitive phenomena such as memory. And I will be trying to persuade you that linguistics should not be the science of English, and I will tell you how important Polish is. And I want to encourage you maybe to start learning the language. So today I will be talking about my current study, my research involving Chinese learners of Polish. And I will present a couple of theories that will help you to understand what this study is about. And then some preliminary findings, because the study is still ongoing. So even though I have some concluding thoughts, I want you to make your own conclusions and maybe share them with everybody after this talk. But before starting talking about the study, let me introduce the research team first. So Out of Our Minds was set up by Professor Dagmara and Professor Petar Milin at the University of Birmingham. And we are a cross-disciplinary group consisting of 14 scholars at range of abilities. So that involves linguists, psychologists, and computer engineers. And we are proud that we can say that we speak 10 different languages. So we are really celebrating that. And we are a very busy team. Our current projects involve, for example, the effect of corpus-based activities on EFL learners. So this is what our friend Sadim is currently working on. Laurence is creating teaching materials based on computational stimuli. Another postdoc, Dogosh, is preparing methodological excellence in data-driven approaches in linguistics. Yuhan is investigating Chinese EFL students' cognitive efforts and processes during integrated language tasks. And Evita is working on effective ways of L2 teaching based on technology-enhanced language learning. And myself and my research is on memory and language. So this is the study that I will be talking about. But first, let me present the two theories. And the first one is the theory of memory. Human memory can be categorized in many different ways, one of which is distinction between something called declarative and procedural memory. And both memory systems have large capacity and can store impressive amount of information. So declarative memory is flexible relational memory, and learning in this system is very fast. Example might include, for example, an important event from your life, what you had for breakfast today, or for example, what's your parents' birthday, right? So procedural memory is less well understood, and it is generally accepted to be acquired unconsciously. And learning in this mode is slow, but the information, the access to this information is very fast, automatic, and reliable. And according to the way information can be accessed or retrieved, declarative memory can be also described as explicit memory, and procedural memory can be described as implicit memory. So moving on to the second theory, which is theory on language cognition. So when it comes to language, most of the theories on language and language cognition focus exclusively on the split between grammar and lexicon. So according to this theorist, lexicon and grammar play central role and are viewed at two opposite ends of a continuum. So according to this view, grammar involves the rule-based procedures, sequences, and hierarchy, whereas the lexicon is about associations and idiosyncratic knowledge. So I will be telling you later that this is not as simple as it may look at first sight. So when we merge those two theories together, so the theory of memory and theory of language, we can say that since language learning is another type of learning, so we need to learn a vocabulary of a new language, we have to learn grammar and derive them from memory in, for example, in a conversation many times under the pressure of time. It is assumed that memory also plays a role in language learning, and it's happening in the following way. So declarative memory I presented before, which is handling the lexical knowledge. So as you remember, learning is fast and access to the information is very slow and controlled. So, for example, this is nicely illustrated by tip of the tongue phenomena. So when, for example, when you learn another language and you learn new vocabulary and then you want to use this vocabulary and you've forgotten the word and you're thinking what the word is. So this is showing you nicely that access to this information is very slow, controlled, and fallible. Whereas procedural memory is handling the rule-governed knowledge of grammar. So you may spend very long time on learning one particular grammatical structure, and you practice and practice and practice, and then when you use it in a conversation, use it unconsciously, you even don't know when you create a correct sentence because it's kind of automatic. So the access to this information is very automatic. Because of the so-called grammar lexicon split that I told you at the beginning, and that dominates research that I have already mentioned, different types of language knowledge are viewed at two opposite ends. But we know that language is something more than words inserted in grammatical frames and structures. And example of this one may be morphology. Because some words, in addition to meaning, they have some grammatical properties. So, for example, the English word play we may interpret it as a nice, fun activity, but at the same time, it conveys that the activity is happening at the time of speaking because of the ing ending. And in this way, we can view language on a continuum. So we can have lexicon on one end, grammar on the other, and something in between. So this thing in between is morphology. And this is where Polish language comes in. And this is Polish language, as we know. We have quite a few Polish speakers, right? So we know that Polish is a very morphologically rich language. For those of you not familiar with linguistics, by saying morphology, I mean form, shape, and structure of a word. So the morphological difference between Polish and English is richness of form. So, for example, English word play can have only 3 forms. So that's play, played, and playing. And you can compare it to the number of forms in Polish. So the situation looks equally complex when it comes to Polish verbs. So thanks to this morphological richness, Polish allows us to go beyond this dual split of grammar and lexicon in understanding the memory for language. It allows us to create continuum spanning lexicon and grammar on both ends with morphology in between, rather than this dual split between lexicon and grammar, usually tested using languages that are very simple, such as morphologically simple, such as English. So the morphological knowledge tested using Polish in the study I conducted is case and aspect. So when it comes to a case, we know that every single word, every single noun in Polish needs to be inflected for a case. So this is the example is in the first sentence, and for verbs, verbs can determine whether action is ongoing or completed, irrespective of whether it happened in the past, present, or future. So you have violations of these two rules if you can read Polish on the screen. So what we did for our study, I will start with participants. So our participants were undergraduate and postgraduate students at 4 universities in Poland. They were native speakers of Chinese. And to collect the data, I traveled to Poland, and at the end of last year, I visited 4 universities. So that included Poznań, Toruń, Warsaw, and Krakow. And the data come from 55 Chinese students speaking Polish at proficiency level of B2, which is quite like upper intermediate. We have 4 teachers here who can clarify this. And this is not So moving on to the design, I administered 3 tasks and a language questionnaire. So the task included something like grammaticality judgment task, implicit memory task, and explicit memory task. And I will be explaining what each of the tasks involved in the following slides. So the grammaticality judgment task is the main one that we conducted. And in this task, participants had to decide whether a sentence is grammatical or not. And they were presented to the sentence orally, so they were presented to it on headphones and confirmed their choice on a key press. So as you can see, the equipment involved our own laptops, keyboards, and headphones. And each participant judged 196 sentences presented in 2 conditions. So the first condition was a single condition with 96, so half of the set, 96 sentences where the grammaticality of judgments was tested. And in the second condition, so-called dual task condition, there were another 96 sentences, and the grammaticality judgment was combined with another task that kind of divided attention. So here is what it looked like. So each participant was presented with 192 stimuli, it means sentence, and half of each set consisted of experimental and half of filler. This is a very common practice, so that they didn't know what we were testing. It has to be disguised. This is very common in this type of research. And half of each experimental set consisted of grammatical and ungrammatical sentences. And the knowledge tested grammar, so the use of subordination, morphology, case and aspect that I mentioned before, and lexicon was represented by collocations. So collocations are words that go together and they like kind of each other. So I want you to perform this task, maybe to have kind of a hands-on experience of what they actually did. So I will show you what they had to do, what all the participants had to do in the single condition and in the dual condition. So in the single condition, they listen orally to the following sentence. Let me play this sentence.
Can you read it? Yeah, because we got stuck.
Yeah, so I'll try to play it from my phone. Right.
Ostatni raz byłem na wakacjach w polskich górach.
Next click. So basically, I wanted to show that the next step was to decide whether the sentence was grammatical or not. Okay, so that was the single condition. So there was a sentence that they could hear on their headphones, and then they had to press the key on the keyboard. They had to press the key corresponding to whether the sentence was grammatical or not grammatical. And for the dual condition, revision of all the talk. Right. If you go down. Okay, and next one. And then in the dual condition, I flashed 3 digits on the screen. So I want you to remember the digits now. And then again, they listen to another sentence.
Ostatni raz byłem na wakacjach w polskich górach.
And then they had to recall the digits. So as you can see in this dual condition, your attention is divided in between 2 different tasks. So the first task is kind of storing the digits in your memory, and the second task is processing the sentence because you need to decide whether it was grammatical or not. And if your judgment was correct, it means that the declarative memory, which was blocked, is not taking part in processing of the sentence. And if your judgment was, if it was not correct, it is likely caused by the lack of access to this declarative memory because it was busy working with storing the numbers in your mind. So in other words, we can say that dividing attention impedes access to the declarative memory while leaving procedural memory unaffected, and hence constituted a test that dissociates with type of linguistic information each long-term memory construct subserves. So, for example, if the sentence that they were listening included a violation of case or aspect, so again, if the sentence in this particular example was correct, it means that declarative memory did not play role. If it was not correct, if the judgment was not correct, it means that the declarative memory, I don't want to mix things up, but you've got the idea. Okay. So that was the grammaticality judgment test. So as I said, there were 3 tasks in total. So task number 2 was the explicit memory task. And in this one, it was called Llama F. And participants learn a new grammar of a new language. And they were presented to 20 images and corresponding labels. And following that, there was a testing phase. And it was for the learning phase, they had 5 minutes, and then it was followed by test where they were presented with image and 2 labels, and they had to select one which correctly described what's on the picture. And the second task, the third task was the implicit memory task. In this assessment, we are looking at learning abilities below the level of consciousness. So as I said, it was the implicit memory. And participants were asked to respond to instantly changing dot on the screen, so we can see the 4 white fields and the dot was moving from one to another, they had to decide on the position on the dot by pressing the corresponding button on the keyboard. So it kind of showed us whether they could recognize pattern and they were quick enough to respond to this in this task. So both tasks, the new grammar learning task, the Llama F, and this one were administered to see if there exists association between different types of learning, so implicit and explicit, and memory structures, declarative and procedural. So strong explicit learners were predicted to have a good declarative memory, and strong implicit learners were predicted to have good procedural memory. So what it all told us. So we analyzed 3 dimensions of performance, so speed, accuracy, and consistency of answers in the grammaticality judgment task. And the results that we obtained so far suggest that learners could transform from grammatically simple language, which may be surprising, but that's Chinese, which is grammatically simple language, to a more complex one, such as Polish. No single linguistic type is handled by procedural memory, even in case of immersion in levels above B2, which is a bit surprising. So we don't see that language moves from the declarative to unconscious procedural memory. This is something we would expect at higher level of proficiency when language becomes more automatic. This one didn't happen. And we also saw that students did many errors despite of the fact that they were advanced B2, and many of them were C1 learners, which and the errors had to be removed, which left us with not enough data to perform our analysis. So in conclusion, Polish, alongside other morphologically complex languages, can shed very important light on memory for language, as they are complex, more complex than English, and can we do more with them? And this theoretical insight in turn will help us to work on more effective teaching and learning strategies. And it is therefore important for Polish to be continued in teaching and learning, not only as an ancestor language, but also as a foreign language. And that's everything. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Justyna. Does anyone have any comments? Anyone?
So just one question. The Chinese learners in Poland were learning Polish for a language degree, or they were learning Polish to study something else, another subject?
Yes, so some of them were Polish language learners, so they were attending Polish classes, and many of them were actually studying in Polish alongside Poles on a different subjects. So yeah, so there was a mixture, and the first ones were usually those at lower levels, and the more advanced it can be seen that they were good enough to study in Polish as a medium of instruction.
So that was the kind of preparatory year before starting their degree in Poland. Is that so?
Yes.
Yeah. And the other question, very quickly, but it would be nice to talk more later, is do you think, or did you conclude, or are you looking at this angle, whether there's any connection between them not being able to use the procedural memory, was it? So much? Did I, yeah. And the fact that they were Chinese speakers? Do you see what I mean? Or I mean, like, if you want to kind of use a different cohort of subjects with a different language, an Indian language, let's say, or something like that.
I can answer this question based on my PhD findings. So I will move slightly to another study if you don't mind me doing this. And for my PhD, I compared language in 3 different groups of students. So this involved native speakers of English, Chinese, and European students. And from what I found was that there were big differences in the skills at the beginning of the first year at the university, with Europeans being closer to English And after 1 year, I saw there's been massive improvement in European students, but Chinese stayed basically at the same level. So we look at this cross language differences. So we think that because of the fact that English and Chinese are very distant and they belong to two different language families, is that add additional difficulty for them to learn and process the language, whereas for Europeans it was much easier because we all belong to the same language family. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, but I'm sure there are big differences between European languages as well, if we were to look closer, but it's very.
Yeah, that would be interesting to see
Yeah.
what it looked like in different language groups.
Yeah. Thank you.
And now for our final speaker, Sebastian Hanek, who's a PhD student at the linguistics program at the Jagiellonian University, Doctoral School in Humanities, and an auxiliary employee at the Department of Communication Theory of the Faculty of Polish Studies at the Jagiellonian University. He's a Polish philologist, cognitive linguist, and researcher of the discourse non-heteronormative communities. He's also passionate about cultural changes in the private and public discourse. Thank you, Sebastian.
Thank you. So at the beginning, I'd like also to thank you all, to the organizer, especially to Dagmara, who put an effort in finding me on ResearchGate, writing me directly, I am even more grateful because it's not that common for Polish PhD candidates to get an invitation to anywhere, especially to other country. And that was really nice. And thank you very much for that. And thank you to all the ladies for extraordinary speeches. I hope I'm gonna keep on the left. So today I'm going to speak to you on a really important topic for me, because the title of my presentation is In Search of One Space in Language, Gender-Related Crisis in Polish Communication Sphere. I'm going to show you the historical background first of the gender crisis in the Polish language, starting from the interwar period, going through the war period, the Polish People's Republic times, and finally ending with the analysis of contemporary Polish. The key concept for this presentation basically through the implementation of which the problem of gender inequality in language was able to grow to such large proportions will be the genderization of language. In addition, I will analyze related phenomena such as grammatical social gender asymmetries, lexical gaps, feminatives, non-binary strategies for familiarizing ourselves with the non-binary in language, and a lot of others. As Poland over the last 250 years has been blocked by various problems, including partitions, 2 wars, Soviet occupation. The language as well has gone through various phases related to social-political issues. Between 1795 and 1914, Poland was divided between 3 invaders: Austria-Hungary, Russia, and Prussia. In each area, the living situation looked a bit different, but it should be noted, however, that Polish culture, including the language, was cultivated at the time in secret for fear of sanctions. During the partitions, the function of maintaining cultural awareness and knowledge of the Polish language was taken over by women who, wanting to raise their children in a spirit of patriotism and a sense of national identity, taught them the language, patriotic songs, and the works of the greatest Polish writers. The periods of the First and Second World Wars as points in history when Poles faced a huge crisis. Seems, from my perspective, limited in terms of resources that can be explored and their diversity, so I decided not to comment on them. During the interwar period, anyways, the Polish nation has had a moment of peace. It was a period of increased development, both intellectual and industrial. At the level of Polish language, a number of changes could be observed. Which was also like positive approach to feminatives. Linguists claimed that the use of female forms of denoting professions and functions is an expression of higher level of thinking about society and language. And the feminatives themselves make it possible to include women in all structures of social life in which they have been invisible so far. During the functioning of the Polish People's Republic, the rulers gradually introduced censorship. All official forms of address marked with the respect were used in the masculine plural form, most often preceded by the phrase towarzysz. Such constructions only intensified the already visible gender asymmetries in the language and caused a regression of the achievements of the interwar periods on this level. And after the fall of the Iron Curtain in 1989, Polish linguists again encouraged the public to use feminatives, but after a few years, it turned out that the Polish speakers, exposed to the multitude of problems and information of a linguist nature, considered the problem of this gender asymmetry to be less important and ignored that. And this state lasted until, I think, 2011, when the then Minister of Sports, Joanna Mucha, used for the first time the feminative for the to define her position, that was ministra. It was pretty popular in Polish public discourse. And this event has started social discussion about gender inequality in language. So now I want to tell you a few things about these asymmetries and related phenomena. The primary problem is the strong genderization of the Polish language, manifested in grammar, phraseology, and lexicon. The first example of the progressive disappearance is the progressive disappearance of the neuter gender, which is applied only to inanimate nouns. For example, słońce means sun, or liceum means high school, and to young animals, for example, Jagiellonian or źrebiec. The only examples of living nouns related to a person are dziecko, means a child, and today somewhat archaic names of young representative or of particular sexes. Dziewczę, girl, and chłopie, boy. Such transformation consolidate the binary dichotomy of gender identification and limit the possibility of creating constructions supported by no neutron. Another limitation of the Polish language is the primacy of the masculine genders, and as well as the verb forms associated with them. There are two dimensions of this phenomenon. The masculine gender can mean both a man representing a given category and any person belonging to it, regardless of gender. For example, president means both men or women, and similarly, for the masculine gender, one speaks of either of a group of men or a mixed group. For example, mieszkańcy poszli, that means resident went, or uczniowie pisali, students wrote, and we don't know anything about the gender of each member of these groups. In other words, two different functions of the masculine gender can be defined. The distinctive one, pointing directly to a specific object, and generic one, pointing to an object as an element of generically unified group. This stagnation is related to the problem of introducing effective feminatives into the language, which results directly from the existence of the so-called lexical gaps. What's more, a relationship can be noticed the lower the social prestige of a given profession of possession is, the easier it is to create a female version of the word, and that will be accepted in the language. The discussed gender asymmetries not only make it impossible to depart from the traditional division into men and women, but also emphasize the equality of relations between them. The other phenomena is related to the word formation, primarily of masculinities. Only in a few cases is the feminative the word foundation, the word formation basis. Moreover, pejorativization of feminine nouns can also be observed, either on the basis of the dehumanization. For example, we've got krajan, that means compatriot. Then we've got krajanka, a female compatriot, and then for now, we don't use that much krajanka, and in this particular meaning, and we use it more than to describe some kind of sweets that goes in the little parts. And the other way of this pejorativization is on basis of progressive depreciation. And here we've got dziewka, and that was unmarried woman in even 18th and 19th Polish. And now we've got a bit shorter version, dziewka, that means prostitute. And what's tricky, that we've got a lot of examples connected with sexually working women in this case. Another obstacle worth pointing out is the lack of gender-neutral nouns and pronouns, including the names of relations, functions, etc. To be able to systematize knowledge about the world and be able to function in society, a person must be able to name, which is basis of effective communication. With reference to the previous paragraph, it can be said that the Polish language is not ready for the female president and female minister. In Polish, prezydentka or ministra, and even if it will be ready, we have to think further and to admit that we can be sure for 100% that it's not ready for neutral forms, such as ministrze, prezydencie. In the case of non-binary people, the problem is not only the names of prestigious positions, but also, or perhaps mainly, the names of the simplest relationships. The binary nature of the gender division is manifested in the most of the vocabulary related to the names, for example, of family members. And here we've got two good examples of the first ones, where we've got matka, mother, ojciec, rodzic, ojciec, father, and rodzic, parent. Then we've got córka, daughter, syn, son, and dziecko, child. But then we've got babcia, grandma, dziadek, grandpa, and nothing. Also ciotka, aunt, wujek, uncle, and still nothing. We're not talking about locks in prestigious, high position and functions. We're talking about everyday life. And that's the biggest problem for non-binary people. So the problem of the lack of gender-neutral honorifics and addresses should be also mentioned. The binary division into gentlemen and ladies leaves no room for the gender identification, for other gender identifications. What's more, the collective form, państwo, let's say it's official they in Polish, applies the already mentioned principle of the primacy of the masculine gender, which only deepens the race problems of inequality, is connected with the forms of verbs that we used going with that noun państwo. Thus, the discussed situation only generates discomfort not only for non-binary people, but also for the language users communicating with them, whose gender identification falls within the traditional dichotomy. So it's not only the problem for non-binaries, it's the problem for all of society, because we non-binary people need some tools to communicate with the world and between each other. but also the world needs some tools to communicate with binaries. So the last problem to which I draw attention are grammatical cognitive limitations. So they consist in the need to apply structures related to the binary division of a gender, even to gender neutral phenomena, due to the lack of linguistic means that would allow for the that gendering, let's say. And the good example here would be, for example, talking in Polish about the hijra phenomenon. And hijra is an Indian priest who does not identify with the gender assigned to him at birth. So even when I'm talking in Polish and I'm trying to talk in Polish in the neutral gender about hijra, it's impossible because I don't have a paradigm to use that for the nouns that are for the nouns ending with a in neutral gender. That's just impossible. There are two ways: either build a new paradigm or build new rules, and I'm not sure what's easier. So a few words about non-binary. So on the slide, you can see a little picture that is basically picturing the main idea I wanted to tell you about non-binary. Because in Poland, non-binary is still perceived as a new phenomenon, and therefore it is marginalized. What is beyond that, however, is that gender binary in many cultures is not the norm. So we already mentioned Indian hijras. We can mention also Mexican maxas or Albanian sworn virgins. They could be given as an examples of that. And importantly, non-binary can be understood in two ways. On the one hand, any gender identity that could be placed on the spectrum between a woman and a man. On the other hand, it can be understood as a completely independent identity, a kind of bridge in the binary gender division. But I want to tell you what is it for me. Non-binary means something more, because it is a kind of freedom of a choice, space for the development and transformation of one's own consciousness, a field for trying to consider such a seemingly fundamental, unchanging, and obvious concept as a gender. And the discussed gender identification is a final break with the division into women and men that restricts the expression of an individual, which is caused by the cultivation of assumptions of biological determinism and an attempt to deconstruct the existing social order in which a person can be assigned any characteristics while regulating its cognitive abilities. Here we've got time for another slide. Yeah. In the last part of this speech, I'd like to present you a few selected proposals for introducing non-binary to the Polish language. The choice of the choice of communication strategies was based on the information collected on the website Zaimki.pl, where non-binary people and their allies collect ideas on how to organize space for themselves in the communicational sphere. The first strategy is pretty simple because it is using binary forms. It is most often consistent with the person's passing. Such actions can be described as conformist attitude, let's say, because it aims to limit both the visibility and differences and the possible negative consequences that could be drawn against a non-binary person who does not comply with the assumption of the traditional gender dichotomy. Another way non-binary people communicate is by using the neutral form gender. From a theoretical point of view, due to the previously discussed phenomenon of limiting the scope of this gender to non-human nouns, the use of this solution could evoke a sense of dehumanization in non-binary people. Interestingly, non-binary people do not seem to feel these potential threats and claim that this is one of the most common communication strategies used by them, and they don't find them depressing in any way. Next, we should mention the formation of neutratives. For example, that means gender-free nouns. It is something new in Polish language. That there are no systematic rules that we would have to create them. However, this is the most often, I think, solution used by non-binary people, and in most of the cases, it is done by adding suffixes such as e, l, o, or and others. Here we've got some, I think we should get some, we don't. Some examples, such as artyście, inżynierze, policjanto, modelum. And it should be noted that from the systematic perspective, some of these are related to other word formation processes, such as creating diminutives or names of young animals, which may lead to lowering the prestige of the function defined by the neutral, or introducing a humorous coloring to the lexeme. But non-binary people seem not to care about that. And I think that's goodly. Let us not forget the use of postgraduate. I had a big struggle with translating that, so I left it in Polish. Basically, there are constructions that are built using the noun osoba, person in English, and an attribute, usually in the form of an adjective or adjective participle. For example, osoba rodząca or osoba sędziowska. It should be noted that such constructions have a feminine grammatical gender, but this should not be confused with gendering, since the noun osoba in Polish refers to both men and women. So it's only about the grammatical gender, not the social gender, let's say. However, this doesn't change the fact that some osobatywa still, especially those whose element is an adjective, may sound artificial or incomprehensible. For example, we've got osoba informatyczna, that means IT person, or osoba matematyczna, that means math person, let's say. There are also no developed system rules, as in the case of the neutratives, for the creation of these forms. Basically, the user is faced with the dilemma of choosing between an adjective and adjective participle, and not knowing whether they should use the form of osoba studencka with an adjective, which somehow includes additional information as a feature of the identity of the specified unit, or the term with the adjective participle, osoba studiująca, which treats this additional information only as a temporary function of the unit. And it turns out, however, that the non-binary people seem to willingly use these forms, do not perceive them as problematic in meaning, and what is more, they emphasize their universal character resulting from the gender neutrality, and fully embedding in the patterns of varieties. The next two strategies are innovative approaches to language problems faced by non-binary people. The first of them is the use of post-gender duchaisms, and that means a new conjugation paradigm developed by the writer Jacek Duka in the novel Perfect Imperfection, and then developed by users themselves to the declension pattern called ducatives. Verb forms are formed by using the gender-neutral suffix "you" or "um." For example, zrobił, kochałam. Nouns are produced by adding the same suffixes to the base, so kochanku or nauczycielu. The forms of ducative pronouns are onu, jenu, henu in singular, and onu, jene, tene in plural. From the systematic perspective, it may seem problematic to overlap the nominative form of the ducative with the form of the locative masculative, which may lead to misunderstanding on the semantic level. That's pretty important, I think. But we have to also say about the second new strategy, that is the continuous production and use of the neopronouns. The list of them is still open, and the new ideas for more gender-neutral pronouns are popping up all the time. Among the most popular are listed here: wonowego, noego, no. So basically, there is the most interesting ones include the use of ligature ash or Polish nasal vowels one, jene. The surveyed non-binary people are reluctant to use these constructions because they consider them too new and unfamiliar for binary language speakers. And the last method of introducing non-binary into the Polish language consists in replacing the personal morpheme of the inflectional ending with any graphic character. It can be everything. What do you want? And basically, these methods can be used, of course, only in the written language, but it allows for the introduction of the of gender neutrally, which does not require any intellectual effort. That's important, and particularly. There are two noteworthy perspectives. First one, on the one hand, there is the use of the underscore that would be a mental space of choice for both the sender and the recipient of the message. And on the other hand, the use of X would indicate some kind of aggression, a desire to tear apart both spaces, and division. So it can be read as an extension of the idea of patriarchy. And sum everything up, I have to admit that the Polish language in its current condition does not allow non-binary people to communicate effectively. Limitations occur both at the level of the language system and the political and social level. Polish language users are somewhat tired of the constant changes that have been taking place at the very rapid pace since 1989, are reluctant to accept both new versions of reality and new linguistics phenomenon. However, there's a question, do we need to produce new forms to include non-binary people in communication? So there are some ideas that we don't. And one of them is the use of the form called pluralis majestaticus for non-binary people. This construction basically consists in using verbs, pronouns, and adjectives in the masculine personal plural form, second person, when addressing individuals. So the example would be babcia przyszli w odwiedziny. So one should consider the potential gendering of this structure. After all, it uses the masculine personal gender, but it should be noted that this form, from the historical point of view, was applied to both women and men. It can be therefore assumed that in this case of using the masculine personal gender, it should be considered only as the grammatical gender that does not violate the gender neutrality of the discussed form. Moreover, this structure had an enabling character and was applied only to people who deserve the greatest respect. So this positive evaluation contained here would not only create a space for non-binary people, but also this, not even creating, but recalling this form, as it was reserved only for people that deserve the highest respect, would also let's say enable other language users to destigmatize this community and include them in their own circle. And finally, we should consider whether there is a recipe for effective communication with non-binary people. Of course, there's not. And due to the change in the profile of identifying an individual, no longer based on the visible physical features, clothing, or functions performed, the language users are forced to make additional intellectual effort to identify a person. Therefore, the easiest solution seems to be to ask a question, a simple question about forms and pronouns, and in online communication to save this information on your profile. And it's not only for non-binary people, it's to all of us to make it easier to communicate for non-binary people. And what's most important, it cannot be expected from all representatives of a given gender identification that they will want to use the same forms. Some women may prefer a form profesorka, that is feminine of professor in Polish. And some of them will stand by the form pani professor, Miss Professor. And therefore, the most important thing for me seems to be respect for the choice of the individual, because they have the right to create their own identity also at the level of language. Thank you very much.